Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Skull and his interns, except we have unfortunate news to report. Howard, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really too bad that current crop of interns is no longer with us. A lot of people assume that we'll probably lay that at the foot of the skull, but really, dozens of people spontaneously combust every year. So,
it's all the time.
All the time.
Yeah, all the time. Right. And I've got to say, really, you think after the first three disappeared in the disintegration booth, they would have clued in sooner that it wasn't a teleportation chamber. Yeah.
I mean, interns.
Anyone could have confused the wombat repellent and the wombat attractant. That was the saddest incident of all, I think.
I've done it myself.
Yeah. So anyway, since we don't have those interns with us anymore, we've invited Seth Lindberg, Chris Hocking, and James Enge to join us.
Hey. Hello.
Welcome, everybody.
Should we go around the room?
A lot of us are still in mourning over the these deaths, but it's
I grew very close to intern number 44. I was on the cusp of learning his name, and with great regret. Who knew that polishing sarcophaguses, if done in a counterclockwise fashion, could lead them to rise from the dead?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you learn by doing.
I guess the question of the hour basically is submissions with the skull and how they're coming along. What have you been hearing about submissions to the skull, Mr. Jones?
Well, the interns were kind enough to pass along some good stuff my way, and of course, I've also been reading things myself. So there's been some good and there's been some instructive as well. And I think some of the more disappointing things are the cat poems that we've received. Some detective novels. One of them featuring a dwarf. That was immolated promptly. On more serious notes, I think I'm most surprised that I'm not seeing a whole lot of barbarian fiction. You'd think we'd be getting, since Sword and Sorcery started by the guy who created Conan, right, in Saul, that we'd be seeing barbarian fiction, but oddly enough, Clark Ashton Smith style fiction has been more prevalent in many cases. I see a lot of wizards, and I see a lot of thieves. And I thought that was interesting because as recently as, 10, 12 years ago when I was reading Slush for Black Gate, Clark Ashton Smith's influence seemed to be non-existent. And all of a sudden, I guess people are reading him again, so that's nice. But I don't want to be just a magazine that's primarily only doing sorcerers. Seth, you worked with some of the interns before their untimely demise. What were they telling you?
Yeah, I was able to actually kind of dig through the remains of one who had try to keep track of some statistics. They're not perfect because I don't really trust their math skills, but in rough percentages, what I found on number 121's body, it looked like they had about 10% were just not the right length, as if the submitters didn't read some of the submission guidelines. So we got several novellas and novels and a significant amount of flash fiction, around 1,500 words or less, which is not something I think the magazine is shooting for. About another 10% were at least were just in the incorrect genre, like the cat poems, some romance. Just the incorrect genre. There was about 70% that were fantasy, but to your point, most of them were not actually like sword and sorcery based. A lot of them were, bands of 4 or more people meeting in a tavern and then going on a long adventure and going back to the length. A lot of these were around 8,000 words, maybe 10,000 words, which is kind of on the upper limit that you were suggesting on the website. which can be okay, but I think most everything written in Tales so far has some decent amount of like forward inertia, like there's some action up front, and these other ones read more like beginnings to an RPG novel.
Right. They have a more leisurely pace.
Yeah.
I think submitters need to be aware of what we publish. They definitely need to review the guidelines. I think sometimes people are pulling trunk stories like, oh, I've written a fantasy story, and they'll send us something that maybe it's an urban fantasy tale. Sometimes they'll send us stuff that's really well written, but it's just not suited for us. And I think it's because they haven't bothered reading the guidelines. One of the things I'm seeing a lot of is what I've started calling monster manual fantasy, where the sense of wonder is kind of pulled out of it because everything is codified. It's like, oh, that thing over there, that's a griffin. Like, oh, well, ordinary griffin, you know, who cares? Everyone has a list of spells. And look, I gamed for years. I recently began gaming again. It's not like I don't like tabletop gaming. God knows I wrote 4 Pathfinder novels. But that's not what we're about here at Tales from the Magician's Skull. We want sense of wonder. We want the sense that when you encounter something, you don't know what it is. And we don't want that leisurely pace. We want to infuse things with sense of wonder. We don't want every elf to be an elf. As a matter of fact, I really don't want to see too many elves and dwarves. I'd like to see stranger creatures for the most part, because this stuff has been so, I used the word codified earlier. Everyone has got a monster manual, a player's handbook, and I think that's how this thing definitely has to be. And we don't want it to definitely be a certain way. We want each story to be a surprise. I don't know.
Yeah, Howard, I think that's really important.
Someone hit my rant button. Sorry about that.
I think that's really important. It's true in gaming and DCC RPG as well as fiction. If you describe something with a label and everybody knows what that is, it's not wondrous at all. You have to describe it in a way that makes them feel like they were 12 years old and didn't know what everything was yet, and it's still very exciting.
Right.
I think things like magic system kind of misunderstand what magic should be in a fantasy story. Not everything should be understood, and in the real world, not everything is understood. So the idea of codification, that there's a back of the book where you can look for all the answers, that just doesn't make for a good story.
Right, and I'm not saying that there can't be an internal system in the books the way magic works. I mean, you read a cycle of stories, the Robert E. Howard stories, magic has a certain feel. You read the James Enge stories of Morlock, Morlock's magic has a certain feel. His is internally consistent, but we don't want to be reading fiction where it's internally consistent because a game book said this is the way magic needs to be. We want the writers to come up with their own new system and throw that at us. Their own monsters, their interpretations of monsters, not using something that feels like it came from generic fantasy gaming sessions.
Yeah, I'd say that you could write a story that had even a standard monster in it, like just a vampire, and describe it in such a fashion when it came on stage that it would be frightening, it would be terrifying, and you wouldn't have it labeled. It wouldn't be so clearly fit into a niche. It's all in how the author, approaches it. You could read a vampire story without it ever being mentioned that it was a vampire, and you could probably pull that off as well.
Right, and that comes to the description, right? When the monster enters the scene, you don't want to say, oh, it was a vampire. You describe it in detail. You don't use the shorthand. You try to evoke that horror and terror and, again, sense of wonder.
Yeah.
I think I need to see, in a lot of instances, I need to see more pacing. A scene will begin and there's no establishing shot. It just sort of starts. So we don't know what the things look like in the environment around the characters who are talking or whatever, right? And the thing I try to tell writing students is you need to think of yourself as a film director showing where the camera points. You need to have camera shots, you need to have close-ups, you're in complete control over what's happening. And all you got to do to see it done masterfully is read a couple of the best Robert E. Howard stories and just see how he often begins with a wide angle shot and then zooms in to the action. And that's how you need to be thinking. Not that I want everyone to write like Robert E. Howard. Not that that's easy at all. But just look at the opening to some of his stories. He's incredibly cinematic.
Yeah, the early Conan stories are great because nobody knew who Conan was. Howard had to create interest in that character. So I love those early stories, Rogues in the House and A Tower the Elephant, because he's these are like his early appearances. You know, maybe people have read, you know, The Phoenix on the Sword, but they don't have a whole Conan mythology yet. He creates that because of that vividness. Anyway.
Yeah.
I hope we don't come across as like thinking that the Skull is only interested in like nothing but hardcore, you know, Howardian sword and sorcery. Because I think there'd be some interest in almost any vein of fantasy. I don't want to be like a real hair splitter and that this right here is sword and sorcery and nothing else will do. A high fantasy, maybe even a Sword and Planet. If it had that sufficient voltage, if it was well enough done, I think it could still find a home at the Skull. It's just that it'd be better if it was closer to sword and sorcery and not in the realm of cat poems. Cat poems are wonderful. You could write the greatest cat poem that had ever been composed, and it would fit in the Skull. So we're trying to find stuff that, you know, that lands in the Skull's wheelhouse. You know.
Absolutely, it's got to have forward momentum. It's got to have stakes. Got to have stakes for the characters. Things have to matter. You need to tell an interesting story. It needs interesting people doing interesting things in interesting places for fascinating reasons, right? I mean, those are the four things. Plus the momentum, plus the mystery. And if it has a little more Sword and Planet trappings, if it's more on the sorcery end, if it's more on the horror end. Like I said, it's actually kind of cool to be getting so much Clark Ashton Smith influenced stuff, except I don't want it to seem like that's all we're about. And I don't want to just, it's interesting to me that I guess it makes sense that Lonkmar's influence has kind of won out because Lonkmar ended up having an outsized influence on Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm seeing a lot of sort of Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stuff. But I want to see a little more variety.
I think you guys said some interesting words, like voltage, I think is an interesting word, because you're right. When you read certain stories, you just get like, you can't wait to read more, you know? I think forward momentum, which Howard uses a lot, is a great phrase, because if I read a story in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, it just feels like it's moving forward and I can't wait to find out what happens next. Like, that's always really important. I like how you use stakes, Howard, like when there are consequences and stakes to the action and it's not just a routine adventure, you know? And you really start to care about the character or some of the secondary characters and how they'll turn out near the end. Like, these are great things to consider when writing and submitting.
Yeah, the voltage thing is a hard thing to pin down because sometimes that comes from the author's style, and everybody's knows the difference between a book and where you're like thinking about how many more pages till the end of the chapter.
Exactly.
You know? And other books where you're reading and all of a sudden there's a noise in the house. You're like, good. You're like, well, it's like you've woken up out of a nap. Like, what time is it? How long have I been reading? I'm on page 208. How did I get here? I don't know how you can capture that. There's a real diverse authors managed to get there in a bunch of different ways. That's an enviable skill. I wish I had that one. We know it when we find it. When you're reading something and it sweeps you away like that, that's precious, man. That's one of the best things about reading.
Right.
So guys, we had a question from the chat, which is kind of related to this. Somebody said, do the editors always read the whole story, or do you guys ever reject early? Do you want to, not that the editors are reading anything because it's the interns, but do you guys want to comment on what you've heard from the interns?
Well, I can speak as someone who was slush reading Black Gate back in the day. And look, sometimes you're handed a stack of 30 that arrived in a single day. You need to realize that someone who's been reading enough submissions can tell pretty quick. Sometimes I would give sometimes you can tell within the first few paragraphs. You just don't have the time. I always try to give it at least a page or a couple of pages, but you can kind of tell. You can kind of tell pretty fast. So no, if everyone had to read everything that came in front to back, we'd still be working on the first 50 stories. I'm sorry. I wish it were a different world, but that's just not how it works. Time is precious.
Well, that's how we lost intern number 17, right? We told him he could eat his lunch after he finished the first 50 stories, and he died of starvation. It happens.
Have we hectored everybody about the submissions enough?
What was that, Chris?
I was wondering if we'd hectored everybody about submissions enough. I mean, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to hear about the submissions that are coming in. I think that one of the things that I've heard most about is that a lot of them are very passionate. That you can see work in the stories. They don't seem to be dashed off, which is wonderful. I just want to encourage anybody that wants to write sword and sorcery to, if you've got that story, wrestle it down on the page, hammer it into shape, make it into a story, get it down. Don't wake up, 87 years old, wondering why you didn't try to write that story you had on your mind. Try to get it down there, but polish it up as best you can and read it out loud to yourself. Wait till there's that when no one's around, and chew each sentence carefully, to see exactly what you wrote on the page. The most ridiculous things. I'll be writing something and I'll read it out loud to myself and go, wait a minute, that sentence doesn't have a verb. It had a verb when I typed it in my brain, but it somehow never got on the page, and I didn't know that until I actually read the thing out loud. Also, some passages which seem powerful and, mighty, stirring are none of the above when you read them out loud and see what they actually sound like. So give that a spin. That'll help. And write that story, man. I sound cornball, but it's true. Don't let it get away. Get it down.
Reading aloud is good for dialogue too. Sometimes you think something would sound okay when people are talking to each other, but when you try and say it, it turns out maybe not so much. There's also some great advice from a guy named Chris Hocking that I heard once, which is action is character. And I think about that constantly when I'm writing. You've got to show who the character is, not by what you say they feel, but what you show them doing. I think that's one of the big things that separates sword and sorcery from other kinds of fiction, is the focus on action. But that doesn't mean that there's no interest in individual character. It just means it's displayed in a different way. So anyway, that's great advice from Chris Hocking.
Thanks, James.
I think that's all really well said. And maybe I should make clear, as someone who spent, 5-10 years writing pretty generic sword and sorcery and constantly wondering why it got rejected. This is my early 20s. Don't give up. You gotta keep working. You gotta experiment. You gotta read deeply in the genre, and then you gotta read other genres, and then it'll come together for you. I wish it had come together faster for me. There's a lot of younger writers than me who figured it out faster. But don't give up. And if I sounded like I was ranting earlier, that's just because I care about the magazine, and I've seen a lot of slush, and I've watched a lot of poor interns pass away, giving their lives for the magazine.
What nobler cause, though.
Noble cause in service to the mighty skull.
The good news is, thanks to the skull's necromantic talents, we can now recycle interns. So they will be returning, revived from the dead.
Very thrifty.
Yes.
I think a lot of young authors or developing ones struggle with getting that information flow down right, because there's so much you have to get down in such a compact form. And then if you're striving for the originality that the Tales is looking for, it's even harder because you can't rely on those, tropes or motifs necessarily to, get the word count down. And it takes some words to explain something that's new, and then that could detract from the action. So getting the information flow down is, I think, it's really difficult. And one way to help out with that actually is to see if you're communicating, is to find if you can, some victims that are like interns, you know, to read your stuff that might not even like the genre. So I usually use my family members for that. But if you know, find someone who actually doesn't know the genre and ask them, you know, are you getting, you know, is the information getting to you? Or they might look at you and go, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But trying to sometimes finding people outside of the genre, as far as readers, can really help. And if with short stories, you know, like say 4,000 words, 5,000 words, you're not going to take too much of their time, and you'll get a ton of feedback from that.
I think it's really important to have a nice writing circle who will be honest with you and give you good feedback. That's definitely vital. I depend upon my writing circle.
Yeah, that's a good call. We had a couple of questions from the chat that I want to address. The first is that submissions are still open. So submissions opened on Robert E. Howard's birthday in January, and they'll close on April 1st, which the skull refers to as some silly mortal holiday centered around fools. So there's still time to submit if you're thinking about it or on the fence. We've had a lot of submissions. And to answer this other question, somebody said, are sub decisions a straight yay or nay, or do you sometimes request edits and have a conversation about a sub? And I know, just having witnessed some of the, you know, the interns around the around the water cooler, that there's definitely lots of conversations. They do send feedback back and forth. And I thought maybe Howard or one of you guys could tell them about the process, because several of the submissions have gone into the, you know, past the first round at this point.
Yes, as a matter of fact, sometimes I do send things back, say, hey, I really liked this, but I had a couple of issues. And sometimes it's sometimes the issues are quicker to explain than others. I just sent one back the other day. I had there was a problem where a plot point was introduced and then never dealt with, and so the options were either to just snip it out or to address it somewhere at the end. I think that's an easy fix. Whereas I sent another one back the other day and I said, I really like this, but it's too long. I think you should trim out the middle. But it's not going to be an easy fix because the middle has intercalated threads at the beginning and the end as well. And sometimes I send something back, and while progress has been made, it's still not quite ready. And so, you know, if I believe in a story, I can have multiple back and forths. I never say, oh, well, I'm sorry, it's been too long, out you go. The only time I might do that is if the author gets insulting to me or something. And well, then I might cut him off. But
Howard sent any stories back to me for revision, so they go back and forth. You work on them.
Yeah, I feel like we have some stories in some upcoming issues of the magazine that, Howard, you originally, you know, ran it by me a year or two ago, you know, and you've been working with various authors since then on some of these, and now they're sort of really coming together. So there's definitely back and forth and time to think on it and work on it.
That's exciting to see that happen, honestly.
Yeah. So this is great advice, guys. There's one more question from the chat. How did the panelists view the skull in the context of all the other outlets for similar fiction today? For example, Heroic Fiction Quarterly, Whetstone, DMR Books, is it Sursova or Kursova, etc.?
You know, I've never known how to pronounce it. I always assume Kursova.
I don't know.
First off, let me say I appreciate every single one of those outlets. There was a time not very long ago where a short piece of sword and sorcery had no place to go. This wasn't that long ago, guys. This is like a flowering of heroic fantasy like we haven't seen in forever. And I'm glad to see the skull in that company. Fine.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, we're brothers of the sword. You know, we're mightier together. So that's where I think that's where we all are with this. For too long, the kind of fiction that we love to write and read wasn't available anywhere, and now there are multiple venues.
Anywhere.
Yeah, rock on. You know, more power to all of us. May we all live long and prosper. And I think there's a couple of things that were left off that list. What about Weird Book? Mighty Weird Book. You know?
Finally returned, yeah.
Yeah. So.
We've even seen the editor of heroic fantasy fiction, you know, in the last issue, right?
Yeah, Adrian's a personal friend of ours.
Yes,
right.
Right. So San Julian cover, no less.
Good job,
Mr. Simmons.
Jason Carney with Whetstone, tremendous guy, great dude. Dave Ritzland. Look, brothers and sisters of the sword, right? So may we all live long and prosper.
Yeah, right.
His name is Vulcan. Well, hey,
Sword and sorcery on Vulcan. That'd be very logical.
Since we're all here and we've been talking about...
Or maybe it's in the prehistory. It's in the prehistory before they become so logical.
Well, what has everyone been reading? Since we've been talking about reading submissions, we've got all these readers and writers here. What are we working on? What's that, Chris?
Brother, the Bounty Hunter. It's substantial.
Wow.
So, Neil Werner's, no holds barred sword and sorcery extravaganza. I steered away from this for a little while because it's from the Warhammer universe, and I thought it might be a little bit too involved for me. But this is some of the most head first, balls out, blood and guts sword and sorcery you could ask to find. It's pretty delightful. Has probably the most ferociously badass protagonist you could ask to see, and some of the slimiest villains you could ever ask to see, all of whom meet a grisly doom. It's very satisfying.
That sounds great.
It is.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of that and some of the other Warhammer stuff for years. And I keep telling people, don't be put off because you think it's just game fiction. It is. Some of it is just excellent. And Brunner is one of my very favorites. James, what have you been reading?
Well, I've been reading a bunch of old Icelandic sagas and crime fiction, which go together surprisingly well, like W.R. Burnett, Asphalt Jungle,
Right
on, Little Caesar. You add magic, and it's a sword and sorcery novel for one thing. They're sort of born out of the same terse, get to the point sort of writing, but still really vivid, broad strokes of character. The old Icelandic sagas, I mean, they're harsh, they're terse, there's magic. There's a bunch of loners going through the woods, running into monsters. I mean, it is actually early sword and sorcery. It's real weird. I'm rereading them after a break, and it's been surprising how deep they sink into the imagination.
They also have
so those are my two big things.
Most understated humor of like anything I've ever read. It seemed like the worse things got, the more compelled the characters felt to sort of understate what had just happened. There's one where there's like a battle in a feasting hall, and one character gets his upper lip cut off. And he says, "I was never good looking, but you have made no improvement." It doesn't get any better than that. It
takes some presence of mind to do that when you're bleeding down your face.
Well, of course, who knows when this was written, but yeah, you get the idea.
What's that bit? The Viking character's climbing up the steading. He's trying to peer into the roof to see if the guy they're trying to track down is there, and he gets stabbed. Yeah, and then one of the guys shouts at him, and he doesn't see. Is so and so there? And he says, "I don't know if he is, but his sword is." And then he
That's now. That's awesome.
That's great. James, I have to ask, you mentioned you were reading old Icelandic sagas. Are there that many new Icelandic sagas?
That's what they call their novels over in Iceland. So in a way, I guess. But yeah, I mean, that's the language, old Icelandic.
Okay. Oh, the language, got it. Okay.
But I'm sure there are new ones. So I just don't know them.
So Chris, James, you guys are better read in that genre than the rest of us. If someone were to start with some Icelandic sagas, where should we go? Which ones do you think are the best ones to go for?
Well, boy, there's a couple of different types of them, and my favorite are not necessarily the best. I like the ones about the mythological deep past, like Volsunga Saga, Hrolf Kraki's Saga. That's one with all the magic and monsters and stuff. Arrow Odd Saga. They're called sagas of the old time or lying sagas because they have so many weird things happening. The best ones are probably the Icelandic family sagas like Njál's Saga, which has some great insults in it. There's a character who just rips a new orifice for everyone that he runs into. And not surprisingly, he alienates all of his potential friends and ends up dying, in a burning house. But those are fun because they're such well-told stories with great characterization. But the older ones, or the ones about the older mythology, they have a vibe to them that's hard to explain, but is awesome. And like I say, there's more magic and monsters.
If I was going to recommend one entry-level saga, I'd recommend Eagle's Saga, the saga of Eagle Skallagrimsson. There's not that much sorcery in it. I think he does battle with a warrior who's supposedly a weird creature. But basically, it's just this roguish character wandering around, plundering and wreaking havoc. And as he does so, busting rhymes. He's like basically a poet warrior and creates spontaneous poetry after creating mayhem. And it's pretty ceaselessly entertaining. That's basically was my gateway drug to the sagas.
That's a good one.
G-I-L.
His grandfather's a werewolf too.
Yeah, there you go. You remember it better than I do.
Kveldulf, Evening Wolf.
Are there translations or collections that do these better than others? I mean, is there a definite book that someone should look for, like from Viking or Putnam or somebody?
There's a good series from Penguin. Jesse Bayek translated a bunch of the older ones. Boy, Penguin has been doing good work putting these into paperback. That might be a good first stop.
Penguins and ostriches myself.
Yeah, most of mine are Penguins right at the top.
Seth, what have you been reading?
Well, I might have a call out here to the Sword and Sorcery group on Goodreads that I moderate. We have a Goodreads group read in the next 2 months coming up. And one of the key topics is nostalgia, or books that got us into the reading Sword and Sorcery. And I'll have a confession here too. I kind of had a midlife crisis. But if we think about like Warhammer, where that came out of, it was all like Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson and a lot of the books that they wrote, like with the Fighting Fantasy series back in the early 80s, which got me into it. So I got like the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which, and in here, actually, I want to share something because there's this one, the art in here is awesome, but I'll call out to Russ Nicholson, who's done art for Tales. There's this page of 5 skeletons or so. They're not interns, by the way, but this thing, not yet. But I came across that, I don't know, I was like 8 or 9 or whatever. And that thing has haunted me ever since. So I loved it when I saw Russ Nicholson appear again in Tales. But as I ramble here, so I mean, I'll be rereading some of the early Fighting Fantasy and I guess the stuff that kind of catalyzed a lot of the Warhammer stuff that came out, the decades after. But the key antagonist in this is a necromancer named Zagor. And I don't know, I got infatuated with him. And I had to collect like everything about Zagor last year. I think
is that one of your kids, Zagor? It's all clear now.
Yeah, it took a while for my wife to okay that, but yeah, that's the actual. Don't tell him. I'll get in trouble. But so I had to start tracking down like all these anything that was related to Zagor that they came out, and so they had a couple different spin-off series, and some are really hard to get. This is one, like there's a 4th one called in the Legend of Zagor Chronicles, but the cover art's done by Ian McCraig, who went on then to design Darth Maul. And at the time he was doing all the interior art for this, he was putting horns on everything. So you could kind of see the development of artists and stuff. So, going back and looking at the development of like a lot of the artists over time and how it kind of fed into the genre is kind of something we're going to focus on in the next couple months. But to finish up my confession is, okay, so like I kind of have permission from my wife to get really expensive miniature board games like through Kickstarter. So I spend a ton there. But I don't always have permission to spend money willy-nilly, marriage is like a partnership. So I started to feel guilty, but I had to get the board games of Zagor. And I actually had to call out, I called my dad up to get stuff on eBay for me. So he got me I got the Warlock of Firetop Mountain board game. And then in the UK, I got this thing. This thing's awesome. This came out in 1991. The Legend of Zagor board game box.
I've never even heard of this. This is UK only?
This one came out in UK only, and it has it like an electronic box that does the all the AI for the Dungeon Master. It's hilarious. It's awesome. You get to like press buttons, kind of. I don't know if you ever played Stop Thief back in the day, or when the board game started to try to give an AI, I guess trying a little computer. They didn't have an app, right? So they would give you these batteries and a little thing to press in the early '90s. So thankfully, my dad came through for me, got me these items, and I'm just relishing in the old school board games, and I guess early, I'll call it Warhammer-esque, kid fiction.
Wait, so Seth, I have to make sure I understand this saga.
Yes.
Exactly, why is your dad involved again? Does this involve?
Oh, because I started to tap out what I thought I was approved to pay for.
That's what I thought.
Hobby.
That's what I was reading
yes.
into this.
Yes. So, I mean, it's not a set number, but this is what I'm confessing to you guys. I'm glad this isn't public or anything. So
yeah, for sure. Hope this doesn't end up on the internet.
No. We'll
keep it under our hats.
That's right. That's right. So sometimes you have to call a lifeline and ask a buddy to help you out. So.
Now, I bet John O'Neill has all of that, probably multiple copies at Shrink.
Oh, my God.
You talked with him about it?
What's that?
You talked with O'Neill about...
I have not, though I've seen pictures of his basement, and it's probably in there. I don't know if he knows if he has it.
That might be the only that might be the only game with a fantasy theme that he might actually not have. So if you show it to him, he might become alarmed and run out of the room to go get it.
Maybe I'll bug him. That one was hard to get because they didn't release it in the US. And
I'm dying to know if he's got it now. We have to find out.
Yeah, I feel like I know a decent amount of fantasy genre stuff, but I've never heard of Zoltan's. This must be like a whole UK thing that I missed.
Zoltan is the guy from that the Tom Hanks movie Big.
That's
I don't
right.
think he has a game. This is Zagor.
This is Zagor.
Zagor. Sorry, Zagor.
Right.
Wrong. Sorry, my bad.
That was a deep cut, Howard.
Yeah.
Joseph, what have you been reading?
Lately, it's a lot of short stories that you keep sending me. I feel like I can't keep up, but they're good. I just read 2 from Clint Werner, who you guys, Chris had earlier held up one of his books, and he's great. I love him. And several others that Howard's been sending me. So I'm trying to catch up because I have a queue that keeps growing bigger and bigger. But it's a fun thing to have as a project.
I just dropped a new James Enge story featuring Morlock into the folder, so that's coming your way.
Cool.
I heard he's pretty good.
Yeah.
I think there was a question. There was a question about Morlock in here. I think that came up.
I did see that.
My feed
Just
so if there's cool questions, let me know.
Here it is.
Can I ask a Morlock question?
Sure.
Hey, do you see his career is already formed? Do you see like a beginning and an end?
There are things I know. There are things that I don't. When I was writing the Wolf Age, I wasn't sure whether he was going to die or not. And that really kept me on edge throughout the whole book. It was the 3rd book in a contract, so I thought, maybe I'll go out with a bang. But I have a sense of how he's going to wind up. But it's open enough that I could change my mind about it.
So you don't see yourself sitting down to write a final Morlock story then?
Maybe an extreme old age.
Cool.
Or maybe I'll write it now and leave it with my will to be read after my death.
Right
like
on.
Curtain, the Christie book.
When you sit down to write up a Morlock yarn, do you look at his career and think I need to slot one in there, or I'm in the mood for this part of his life, or does it just occur spontaneously and you fit it in thereafter?
Well, I think it's kind of Howard just my video is getting choppy, so it's probably hard to hear me.
I hear you.
Hear you.
I hear you. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Keep going, Kenneth. Your frequency's on.
But But it's kind of when I'm in the mood for reading. As a reader, Howard talks about not our Howard, but Robert E. Howard talks about the Conan stories as being something like the guy's telling you different parts of his life when he's sitting around in a tavern. And I kind of write the moralic story that I feel like writing at the time. I wrote a few where he goes into a town and there's a problem, and then the problem has some kind of resolution, and I got tired of that. And then I wrote some where he faces monsters, you know. So it's although I have a sense of the broad arc of the career, the details are vague enough that I can settle. I can pick a blank place and put monsters on the map there.
Excellent. Keep them coming, man.
He did stop drinking at the end of the Wolf Age, so that's one thing I have to keep in mind, whether it's a drunk Morlock story or a sober Morlock story.
I love the fact that you're describing writing it the same way I experience reading stuff. You know, that I read it not knowing what's coming next. And it sounds like you write it not knowing what's coming next.
I thought you read it when you're not sober.
That does help sometimes.
Yes.
Well, you, Chris, and your approach to the Ben Hur stories.
I'm doing a straight up chronological thing. I'm pretending I'm writing for the pulps, basically. So maybe more specifically, I'm pretending I'm writing for Dime Detective, like, you know, if it were Sorcery Mag back in the late 30s, early 40s, where each story about a character kind of builds a little bit on the last one. They all stand alone, more or less, but, you know, you watch the progression of a character as you know, he lives and goes through various adventures. So.
And do you have an endpoint in mind for him?
No, that's a little bit more open ended. I know what's going to happen in the world around him, but I don't have an actual endpoint for Ben Hur laid down. No.
Do you see yourself trying to put like series of collections together or anything with the guy?
That's if I accumulate enough stories, I might give that a try. I mean, I'm usually pretty focused on the next story or two and don't think much beyond that, to be honest with you. You could probably tell I'm sort of a laborious plotter. I try to like piece my stories together, and now it takes me a really long time. I'm nothing at all like the pulp authors I most love and respect. I can't write at speed. It takes me a long time.
I sense some fun tension you're going to get into, because I think the tagline for your stories is like the King's Blade, and the tension between Venice and the King is really like ramping up a lot. So I'm trying to forecast how many episodes more they could live together and then still call him the King's Blades. So we'll see where that goes.
Thanks, man.
You made a good point about the pulp writers. I mean, I think they wrote in an era before internet, obviously, before TV. I guess there was radio, but there really weren't as many distractions, you know? So I think they probably could just write for 8 to 10 hours a day. Whereas I feel like between phones and internet and everything, you know, you can't do that anymore. It's a lot harder.
And some of them could just generate story. Like, I don't know. I can't even really imagine. Like, you know, sit down and, you know, in the afternoon and have a fully formed story that we might be reading 100 years later, you know, by the evening. I can't imagine that kind of creativity. That's remarkable. It's just outstanding.
Like Norville Page when he's writing The Spider. I no wonder the stories get increasingly crazy. I mean, you could just almost hear his brain heating up, you know, whether it's killer robots or, you know, fascist conspiracy in New York State or whatever. I mean, he just throws everything at the wall. That's enviable. Wish I could do that.
Do you think they use templates? I mean, somebody asked this in the chat. Do you think they had a standard, you know, structure to the story, or do you think these guys really just?
I know Page did. There's that great article floating around. Maybe I'll see.
Was that the Doc Savage guy?
Oh, you're right.
Yes, Lester Dent.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's a pretty good template, actually.
Some of them used it. Others were very spontaneous. If someone like Max Brand, Frederick Faust could just pound out a memorable story just right off the top of his head. He might not be able to remember it next week, but there it was.
Hey. These guys are the one in the millions. I mean,
yeah.
Max Brand, man, if only we could write that fast, that well. A lot of people write fast and publish a lot, and they're okay. And then there's the rest of us who have to labor long to make it happen. And yeah, I totally relate to the being interrupted. I was deep into fixing up a story just, 2 days ago, and there was a local call, and I thought it was a serviceman that I've been waiting to get back to me. No, they were, we noticed that your car insurance is about to expire, which it isn't, right? It's one of those calls. I was about ready to throw the phone across the room, because every one of those interruptions takes at least 15 minutes for me to get back into the zone, right? And you think that maybe the old pulp writers didn't have to worry about that.
Not so much.
Yeah.
So are we going to see some more Hanover before too long, Howard?
Yeah, I mean, I've been having to focus most of my writing attention on turning over book 3 of my trilogy, which I swear is sword and sorcery, even though the publisher is advertising it as epic fantasy. But anyway, on the side, I continued to work out the Hanover stories, and I plotted it out to this insane degree. I know Chris is probably shaking his head at me whenever I talk to him about it, but yeah, I've got big plans for Hanover. I know him really well and what I want to have happen when, and I've got almost everything thumbnailed now. So
see, the epic sweep is fine by me, but I want to read a story. I want pages in front of me where I can read prose. That's
well, I got rough drafts of 4 written at the end of last month, and so I'll be on the side while I'm working on my next novel project. I'll be putting those together. I really want to accelerate my pace on those, and over the last couple of years, I've been figuring out how to do it. And really, it's just nose to grindstone, writing, and you slowly find ways to be faster. I'm not a fast writer. I'm just too stubborn and stupid to stop.
Somebody in the chat wants to know if you need your ducks cleaned.
Yeah, they're filthy right now. At some point, I'm going to have to actually dig a real pond instead of using that wading pool. It wasn't my idea to get the ducks. That was my wife and my daughter. Like, oh, we should get ducks. We've got a farm. Like, we don't have a pond. Says I, being completely practical. So I've been filling and refilling a wading pool for the ducks, which is just insane, especially in the cold winter. I have to go out there, break up the ice, accidentally break the wading pool, then I have to go find a new one. It's just...
Sorry, Howard. I don't enunciate well. They wrote duct, D-U-C-T, but it sounds like you actually owned ducks, D-U-C-K. Okay.
Do I have to do ducks? Yeah, D-U-C-T.
Do they need tape?
I have gutters I have to clean. That sucks.
Yeah.
Oh, don't talk to me about gutters.
I think
I got this cool thing. It looks like a periscope, and you attach it to a leaf blower, and it goes way up to the top gutters. I haven't tried it out yet because, it's winter, but I'm looking forward maybe to not have to scale the ladders up to my...
Did you buy that for $19.99 at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night?
No, it was just so my in-laws never know what to get me for Christmas because they're not readers. So I always have to give them something practical. I can't say, oh, hey, I'm missing a few ancient Westerns from my gold medal run, or, they think I have too many books already. So I have to suggest something practical. I'm like, what the heck? What can I do? It's like, oh, wait. Let me try one of those gutter things. And so
That's
got
pretty
it.
funny.
You that reminds me that this is kind of the year of the cicada for the Midwest. I think James will get it. I don't know who else will get these, but we use stuff like that to get all the cursed cicada carcasses out of the gutters.
Okay.
I don't know if you're going to get
I might have to invest.
I don't know if you get those where you're at in Indiana.
Is anybody reading any nonfiction? I mean, I always feel, especially history, I always feel like I should be reading more history than I do. Anybody reading anything good, historically speaking?
I'm reading a couple of books on the Italian Renaissance that are pretty cool. But
James, I should have consulted with you, I think, before I tried to read Robin Lane Fox's Classical World. You familiar with this one?
Fox is good, though. Okay. Pagans and Christians, that's another one by Fox. He's one of the few classicists with a movie career. He was in the Oliver Stone Alexander movie, I think.
Which is probably why this one deflected to me from back in the day. So yeah, I'm getting it, but it's, you know, I got to concentrate and focus on it. It's not thrilling me like a piece of 1930s Pulp Fiction, so I got to apply myself.
Yeah.
I am reading Sallust's Conspiracy of Catiline, which is a kind of crime story set in the late Roman Republic, where there's this guy who's trying to overthrow the Roman Republic, and then the consul finds out, and he tries to he uses spies to get back at him. So I mean, that's reminding me a lot of the crime fiction that I'm reading, and also the sagas. It's all sort of blending together.
Yeah, actually, I believe that John Maddox Roberts, oft-time Conan pastiche author, wrote a Roman mystery about that conspiracy.
Yeah, there's one by Stephen Saylor too, who had a whole series of Roman mysteries, and there's one set in the Catilinarian conspiracy. I haven't read either one of those yet, but I think they might be next on my.
I got the John Maddox Robert on the to be read pile, but the to be read pile is as tall as I am.
Sure.
Really.
Yeah, I have one of those too.
So there's a question in here about like a top 5 must read, and that could be a whole discussion, but the suggestion I would have for that maybe would be, especially for sword and sorcery, is just to look into a lot of the great anthologies that have been out printed. There's a bunch of them, but in a very efficient way to get a feeling for the short story, I guess, market and a wide range of styles and authors is to pick up some anthologies. So there's been great ones, and there's a ton coming out now, as people mentioned, with even currently with. So it's not a specific one, but I think going anthologies gets your best bang for the buck.
Yeah, making a top 5 is next to impossible, I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe the first couple books in the Fafnir the Grey Mouser series. Some people like Swords and Deviltry. Some people like Swords Against Death. There's that great collection of the Robert E. Howard Conan stories that are collected chronologically. I forget what the first one is called, The Coming of Conan or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Power of the Dragon.
Yeah.
His only novel. That one in there. Vance's Dying Earth. How many other?
Eyes of the Overworld too, from that sort of same extended series. Crookedly-Clever is so awful, but so awesome.
I love those.
I'd say throw in the Best of Lee Brackett for sure. I mean, that's Sword and Planet, but man, that is some great stuff.
Yeah, leave it to shout out Brackett.
Yeah, Wolf of the Steppes, Harold Lane's first Cossack collection. And yeah, that doesn't have actual sorcery in it, but that's so foundational to Robert E. Howard's own writing. And man, is it great stuff.
Read an issue of Tales from the Magician's Skull. And and when you're done with it, write a review of it somewhere.
Yes.
Right.
Seen anywhere near enough of those, it seems to me. Maybe
a tie into another thing here about, one thing I've always loved about Tales. This was the first time I saw a magazine give you that. The stats for the stuff, for the stories, what Terry Olson puts together, which I just thought it was brilliant that you could read a story and then if you wanted to, you could kind of go play it. So I think that's awesome. There's a question a bit about that too, about will the Skull ever bring in things from the DCC universe? But I was going to use that just as an excuse to call out why I love the Tales magazine so much, is because I enjoy looking through that stats thing at the end and just imagining what I could do with the stories.
Yeah, I think you should always start with the fiction first, because that's how D&D started. It came from the fiction. And then, that will hopefully create a nice little cycle that inspires the games.
I was kind of hoping we'd have like a little section where people would actually use some of the items that have been codified for games in the Skull. They could write in and say if they'd actually used them and maybe tell a story of how they.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
Wouldn't that be awesome? I'd just love to hear about some imaginative thing that one of us made up and it appeared in the story and that someone had used for a completely different, toward a completely different end, and who knows how, in like their own tabletop adventure. That would be awesome.
Yeah. Guys, we have to wrap up soon to keep to our schedule, but these are great suggestions that we should definitely consider.
It's been a blast having everybody here. So thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, you know, and I realize this sounds silly. We never actually introduced ourselves. So, oh, and look
Oh, an intern.
Yes, here's one of our interns. Okay. So I think I might have to duck out early because I got to go be a parent. But
That's understandable.
I'll catch the rest of you guys later. I'll let you guys finish up. Okay. Back to the.
Well, since we didn't introduce ourselves, let's do that real quick. James, you go.
I'm James Enge, writer of Morlock the Maker and some other stuff, most of which is unpublished. What can I say? I read a lot, I write a lot, and I don't have much of a social life.
We're proud to have him so far in every single issue of The Skull, along with Chris Hocking's work, who's up next. Yeah. Chris, tell us about you.
I wrote a couple Conan pastiche, a stack of short stories. I love pulp fiction. I think about storytelling way, way too much. And it's basically my life. And I don't have much of a social life either, or whether that's because of my obsessions or by the by, I don't know.
And Seth is the new managing editor of Black Gate. Tell us some more about you, Seth.
Yeah, so I intern over there as well. And I moderate the Sword and Sorcery group on Goodreads. So that's a good way to, I guess, explore the hobby and still have fun. I've also been interviewing authors and for the last decade or so on the topic of beauty and weird fiction. So trying to make anything from something that's scary or gory, beautiful or appealing. And that's a passion of mine. So that's really about it. I can mention that I've been dying to get a hold of some of these pastiches that Chris has written that have been in limbo. So the Conan and the Living Plague is something I dream about all the time. So it was the idea of getting to it. So
send me a text or something, man. I'll see if I can hook you up.
The other people in the queue here also were giving you well wishes, I think, with those.
Thanks. Anybody who's still interested, we'll wait and see if that comes out. They're still working on it, so I understand.
And then Joseph Goodman departed, and everyone who's at this convention probably knows the mighty Joseph Goodman, who is the officially last to be immolated in the Skulls list. I believe I'm next to last to be immolated, and I'm Howard Andrew Jones. I'm the managing editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull. I know way more than I ought to about Harold Lamb for some reason, and I also write Fantasies for St. Martin's, currently the Ringsworn trilogy, which book 3 is going back to the publisher and will be printed, I guess, in August, which seems an awful long time considering I'm turning over in March, but hey, that's publishing. And also the Hanabar stories for Tales from the Magician's Skull. And that's our adventures and who we are.
Cheers.